welcome to Bad Women again. I'm really happy that you came on this beautiful afternoon, one of the first spring afternoons, and here you are going ready to listen to our talks about bad women. So, when I was thinking about about bad women in literature, I kind of had like a few ideas what happened from the very beginning of our Western tradition, and I took a few notes, which I would like to share with you before talking about my own bad woman, the bad woman in my book. So in the Greek tradition, actually in the Greek tragedies, the Greek dramas, the bad women are always, there are some reasons for their being bad, being assassins, for killing people. These women are very human. I was thinking, for example, about Medea and about Clytemnestra. I'm not sure if I'm saying it well, but hopefully you understand me. And both of them are aging women who feel abandoned by their men, and that's why they, ultimately they kill, right? So there is actually they are victims of the circumstances. Then we have Shakespeare, and he has some very evil women, very evil female characters, like Lady Macbeth, who is a real symbol of evil, right? And in King Lear, we have two of his daughters who are also very evil, and they try to get power and money by intricacies and stuff like that. Then I was thinking about Dangerous Liaison, this 18th century French classic, where there is an evil woman, Madame de Merteuil, who plays games with people. It delights her to play with other people's lives. And, it's not just games, but she tries to gain power through sexual plays, okay? In the 19th century, of course, we have to think about Flaubert and his Madame Bovary. It is really something, how should I say? It's tricky to talk about Madame Bovary because there has been so much criticism written about her, and mainly the male criticism says that she is like a vulgar woman, a terrible woman, and I just don't see her like that, you know. It would be interesting to write about it maybe one day from a female viewpoint. I think she's a frustrated woman who wants to live. She really wants to live, and maybe she makes mistakes. She doesn't make the right decisions, but that's what she does. She wants to live. She is actually very similar to Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, also another, let's say, unfaithful woman, often seen as a bad woman. But since she suffers so much, it kind of cleans her in many readers and male critics' eyes. Then we would have Dostoevsky, and mainly I like his character of Nastasia Filipovna, of the idiot. She is a very, very interesting character. She is kind of an evil woman, but she's a victim. She is a victim of her circumstances, and that also kind of cleans her up. And then we get to the 20th century, and then, there is so much variety of bad women in among the 20th century female characters. So I would just pick up Proust and his long novel about the lost, searching for the lost time, La Recherche, and there is Odette de Crécy of the Swan's Love, and she's a vulgar woman. So the bad women in Proust are vulgar women. Same happens with Nabokov. Nabokov has his great characters, his great female characters. They are great in their evilness, and they are, all of them are extremely vulgar, to the extreme. And then to think about a female writer, there is Irene Nemirovsky, this French writer of Russian origin, who writes very often about her mother, who was one of the like evil and bad women in her novels. A very, very special character who tyrannizes everybody. So anyway, now I'm getting to my own novel, The Silent Woman, which was just very recently published by the Feminist Press. And its main character is Silva. Silva is was born in Prague, and she's vaguely there is some inspiration of my grandmother. I mean, I was thinking of my grandmother when I wrote about her, but that was like a very vague inspiration. The external sketches of her life. But then when I started to write about her, really, she came out like one of the bad women. And now that we were supposed to talk here about this topic, so I was thinking, why is she a bad woman? And is she a bad woman? Or what's happening with Silva? What she does is she has a boyfriend who is Russian, and he's a victim of the 20th century circumstances of the Russian Revolution, etc. And he's actually much weaker than she is, and she herself is also a victim of her circumstances, of the terrible history of Europe of the 20th century. 2 wars, many terrible ideologies, Nazism, communism, all that. And Silva is a victim of all this. She lives through all these things. And she has a terrible time because she is a lone woman with a child. So what happens when she has this boyfriend, she kind of, I think she probably, I don't know, if you read the novel, maybe one day you'll be able to tell me why she does the things she does. Sometimes I do readings with my readers in different libraries and bookstores, and people ask me, well, I think Silva is good, actually, but why does she make such terrible decisions, and why is she actually sometimes a bad woman? Why this? And I always tell them, because a person is made of good things and bad things, right? You cannot have like just a bad thing or a good thing, bad qualities or very good qualities in a person, because we are made of everything, and we are kind of like children of our circumstances, which are sometimes very, very cruel. And this is what happened to Silva. So she actually sends her boyfriend to Russia, even knowing that he will be sent to the Gulag, and this is what happens, and she still does it. And at the end of the novel, her boyfriend actually is able to get out of the Gulag, and he goes to see her in her native city of Prague, and they are supposed to meet. And, well, she has to make a decision whether she wants to meet him or not. I'm not going to tell you what the ending is, but she is very, she might make the wrong decision or the right decision for herself, and make this guy a double victim of her decisions, right? So, well, just to sum up what I just said, I think my Silva, my silent woman, is a kind of character like Nastasia Filipovna of Dostoevsky. But this is what I know now. I didn't know this before I started writing the novel, because I actually somehow I give birth to my characters, and they have their own life, and they go on with their own life, and I just follow them, you know. They do what they have to do, and I just follow them and write about it, but I don't tell them what to do. They know it very, very well. They are, once they are alive, I cannot do anything about it. And so this kind of like Nastasia Filipovna character is just like the Russian, just like the Dostoevskian character. She had a hard time in her life while she was a young girl, and then not so young girl, and this makes her in a way a little weak. And when she is weak, she tries to punish other people also. And so maybe one of the conclusions could be that evil comes out of weakness. Sometimes it can. And then sometimes it becomes a habit, right? So, I don't know. I prefer my readers anyway to talk about my novels rather than myself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm really also pleased that so many of you came out on a gorgeous day to hear us talk about bad women. It's a real honor to be part of the festival, so I'm very happy to be here. You know, I was thinking a lot about this, and I was thinking about African American women in general and how, in so many ways, I think the larger culture treats us as bad women, period, anyway. Like, we're bad for not getting married. We're bad for how many children we have. We're bad for the kind of food we eat. Sometimes we're bad for just the physical space we take up. We're too large. It's so interesting then to think about that and think about creating a bad woman in literature. Sort of the impulse in some ways is to try to correct for all of that. But on the other hand, I'm never interested in creating, you know, positive images. Like, what's that? In everything I've done creatively, my goal has been to sort of replicate the complex humanity that I know exists in people of color, in Black women in particular. And so I feel like I'm always pushing against those typical images that stand out there in the culture when you think of seeing Black women in popular culture. Oh, either they're these asexual, sort of stoic women who are there to bear others' burdens, you know, a modern-day mammy, basically, or they're super sexualized, prostitutes and the like, or they're basically bitches, you know, with attitudes, right? And so my goal, really, when I sat down to write this novel, this latest novel, Into the Go Slow, was to really think about how do I create this imperfect woman, but on the other hand, I wanted to create a hero. I wanted to create a main character, Ella, who was heroic. And by that, I mean someone who is not unlike the plethora of white men along the cultural landscape who are heroic. They're flawed, but you always trust their intent. You know it's going to be fine because they're heroes. I'm like, well, you know, I know a lot of heroes who look like me, and I don't often read about them. So my character is moving through a particular cultural moment. She's part of the Black Power movement of the 70s. She takes that passion to the African continent and decides to get involved in the Pan-African movement and to really try to help do literally feminist work around Nigerian women and girls. So it has a kind of resonance for me right now as we are finding that 234 Nigerian girls have been disappeared. They're missing. And I thought the character I created, Ella, would be the type who'd be writing about that. She'd be writing about that in the local papers in Lagos, you know. And I'm just throwing this out here. I wonder sometimes, had that been 234 boys, the firstborn sons of these Nigerian men? I don't know, but I think it's a thought. It's a question to throw out there. What would the reaction have been? Because I think that what, in a lot of ways, I was trying to do with that character I created was to have someone in literature say, girls matter. And to show that in her own life and in the commitment she was making to telling the stories of, in this case, literally Nigerian girls and women. And so that was a goal, right? To just create this imperfect, heroic character. But I also wanted her to be sexy, and I wanted her to be desired, because I am also of the belief that we don't see that enough, that African American women are desirable. And they can be imperfect, heroic, and desirable. Like, those are not contradictions in terms. They're just unusual in popular culture. So I had all these ambitions. The part that really got complicated for me was when I decided, I guess the part that makes her a kind of bad woman is that she gets addicted to heroin, and so she's a drug addict. So again, I was thinking, you know, often the idea or the attitude is when a woman becomes a drug addict, she has failed in some way, and it's a moral judgment placed on her because she became addicted to drugs. And I'm thinking, for this particular character, given the time she was living and what she was doing with her life, well, yeah, why is that shocking? I mean, to be part of the Black Power movement, to be in the Civil Rights movement, to see what it ultimately became and how a larger culture shut it down, and to deal with that. You're like a foot soldier who then is suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And as we know, soldiers find all kinds of ways to self-medicate and to deal with that. And so when I think about it, it's not unusual that someone in that position would turn to drugs. And so I wanted to take the judgment out. I, as the writer, wanted to take the judgment out of that. You know, when I think about people like, I mean, the way the culture, the way society treated the terrible loss of Philip Seymour Hoffman it gave me pause, because I thought, would that have been the same treatment if he'd been a woman? I don't know. If he'd been a black woman. These are things to just think about. Because it was understood that someone that sensitive and brilliant was struggling and needed to be respected. We needed to respect what happened to him. And so I thought this character, Ella, is equally brilliant and troubled and self-aware and sensitive about what's happening to her and what's happening in the culture. And so there's a way that drugs are just one of many ways that people who are like that deal with that difficulty in society. So I was thinking about all of that as I was creating her, and concerned on the one hand that people would call that stereotypical, that she resorted to drugs, but far more concerned about creating a realistic portrayal of someone who's complex and dealing with a really hostile environment. And how do you handle that? How do you stay whole? She does, in the story, ultimately get therapy, go through drug treatment and come through that crisis. And as a reward to herself, she decides to return to the thing that gave her passion in life, which is working again in Nigeria, in that movement, that Pan-African movement, again, specifically around women and girls. And life doesn't end well for her. It's tragic, but I thought of that as well. I thought, well, that's okay, because it's all about depicting someone who is passionate. That seems progressive when it comes to women, in my mind. Just Someone who's completely uncompromising and passionate about what she believes in and is willing to risk her life. We call that heroics in men. We don't call it bad choices. We don't say, oh, that's a cautionary tale. We say, wow, we got to honor that life. That was really brave. Just in terms of the whole term, bad women, when you think of bad boys, there's nothing negative about that connotation. In fact, if you said the term, I know a bad boy, and you said that to a bunch of young women, they'd go like, where? Can I date him? So it's really interesting, just the idea of what that connotation is, bad woman. So all of those things were roiling around in my head. And a couple more points I'll make very quickly. I really feel that one of the most risky things I did was create a story around not one but two women who happen to be sisters, and make the male character a truly supporting character. His role in the story is to illuminate who these women are, and to really, that's his function. Like, his interaction with those women tell you more about who they are. And I feel that I have seen a plethora of stories where the male has those women in his midst, so you learn more about him. So you think, oh, I understand now how sensitive he is and how caring and like the challenges that face him. But in fact, I think you can know a lot about a woman, and you can understand who she is in large part in how she deals with the men in her life, and they don't have to be the center of attention. It's not a story about how she got a man. It's a story about how she interacted with different human beings, some of whom happen to be men, and how that tells you a lot about who she is. And that felt strangely progressive for me to do that, to not have her end up with a particular man in the story, but to not get rid of that relationship, to just say it was a relationship that revealed something about her and who she is, and then the story is bigger than him. Yeah, that's what I want to say. The story is bigger than him. So I have more to say, but I'll pass it on.
Is this on? Yeah. When I told some friends that I was on this panel, they laughed and they said, well, all of your characters are bad. And I was genuinely a little bit surprised when they said that, because I don't really think of characters in a certain sense in that way. What I do think, I'll sort of talk a little bit about the process of writing, which I think speaks into this subject. When I was writing the first story collection I was writing, the last story that I wrote in it has a pretty simple kind of plot. A mom takes her kids to the playground, and she's exhausted. And through the course of the story, you begin to think maybe she's ill or exhausted, or ill and exhausted. And the kids mostly just go back and forth playing, coming back to her as home base. It begins to rain, and by the end of the story, when everyone else has left the park, she stays in the park for a while more, and then instead of taking the kids home, goes kind of deeper into the park and makes a little home in the woods, a nest in the woods, and puts her kids down for sleep, kind of burying them in the leaves. And the story, as it was unfolding and as it ended, it's a kind of ambiguous ending of whether she's buried her kids or just kind of put them into a fantastic camp out for the night, the three of them. And I was duly kind of freaked out by my own story, but interested. One of the things that I've navigated my life in writing by is to always sort of write myself into a place of discomfort, to write myself into a place of disequilibrium. It seems to me that that kind of place of jeopardy, even though it may not even be apparent to the reader. I'm not always saying, you know, I'm on the top of a mountaintop about to fall off, but to have myself in some relationship to what I'm writing with discomfort has been interesting for me. And that's part of what I think you're doing alone in a room for a while, just kind of creating impossible situations for yourself and for characters and seeing what can happen, what's the range of possibilities. So after that, I kind of realized that I wanted to kind of continue to pursue something along those lines. I was, and it seemed that the sort of biggest pool of my bad characters have been mothers, and I don't think I approached it with a formal philosophy in mind. You know, I'm going to explore bad women, bad mothers. But the more I wrote and the more I watched people's responses, even to the idea of certain stories, like, well, mother, how could a mother do that? How could a mother do that? The more I became interested in it, because the range of what people do, as we all know, as we search what's inside of us, or we search the things we've watched and learned about people, is everything. Women do the same range of everything that a man might do. And I began to work and think about a character who had an interest in having a child, and that was really her sole interest. Early on, as I was writing, as sort of finding my way into the book, the character, the sentence occurred to me, I never wanted a house and I never wanted a husband. And when I sort of landed on that sentence, I had a pretty big gateway into the character and to what might occur. And the book then sort of formulated out of an image which gave me the structure for the book. It sort of was not quite the end image of the book, but the almost end image, which is what I began with, which is a woman waking up in a hospital, coming in and out of consciousness, having tried, having tried to kill herself and her child. That was the image that occurred to me. It's not when you enter the book what's divulged exactly, but she's in a hospital and her child's not, she doesn't know where her kid is. And so it was the challenging thing about a book that's a book of obsession, essentially about maternal obsession, was to navigate a path because of a person, because who would want to read that, really? You know, if that's the case, that's kind of a monstrous thing. And I knew she wasn't monstrous. So I wanted to take what I thought was, in a certain sense, a normative feeling, which is whoever wants to give up anything they love, you know, who wants to share what they love with the rest of the world, you know? How many of us want to share our partners with the rest of the world? And even to watch, as I was watching my own children go off to school, watching the parent at the door of the classroom going like, oh, well, you know, maybe I should wait in the hall while Sammy's getting adjusted to the, you know, I was watching all of the parental separation around me, and there was so much written about how hard it is for kids to separate. I began to be interested in seeing that. Now, most people manage that somewhat successfully, but again, in my interest, I wanted to take what was normative experience and begin to think about it in extremity, to write myself into some kind of jeopardy. The challenge in that was to take a character who I could move through a book in as appealing a way as possible for the longest amount of time, so that when sort of the train wreck happens, you've gotten enough on board with her. And that's, I guess I'm thinking about, how do you manage a character who is about to do something bad, whether out of good intention or out of their own error. And that was a sort of a path in writing that was the complexity for me in that book. And you know, the good news for me was when, well, I'll go with more bad news along the way. So I'm writing my way into this book. It's the first novel I've written. I came to this life in writing as a poet. And about midway through, I'm with another writer, a friend of mine, and she says, "What are you working on?" I say, "A novel." She says, "Oh, well, that's great. That's exciting. What's it about?" And I sort of give her a little kernel of it. She comes back to me about 10 minutes later and says, "I don't think you should write this book. Nobody is going to buy this book. It's just not going to." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" She said, "It's just too hard to market. Nobody's going to buy a book with a woman who's done something so wrong." And I said, "But let's look at all the books where characters have done something wrong. Let's look at Lolita, etc." And then I began, it's interesting that you brought up Greek tragedy. As I moved forward, it seemed to me that the books that were my models were thinking about classical tragedy, in which, we sort of know that notion about creating the worst thing of what you have long, the opposite of what you have longed for. And a book like Lolita, a book of obsession. So the idea of allowing a female to be, in some sense, this isn't exactly the word I ever thought of it as a predator as opposed to the victim, was an interesting idea for me. There's no shortage of books in which women are victims, and I wasn't particularly interested in writing that book. So then I had a book, and it began to go out to editors, and I began to, or my agent began to, and I began to receive responses such as the editor would say, "Oh my God, I read this book in a night. I felt like I was on a train wreck and I couldn't get off, but the marketing department has no idea who would buy this book because women want happy stories." So I was really, that whole sentence really bummed me out. First, the idea that the only reader I would have for a book with a female protagonist were readers who were women seemed absurd to me. It seemed ludicrous to me. And the idea that the notion that all women want are books of, happy female characters or good female characters seemed ridiculous as well. It made, it found a home, it found a life, it had a life, and the idea of so many of the stories or work that I've written have been about navigating the range of what it is to be female. So if that's happened in many cases in fiction that has a character that's a mother, in this new collection of stories, Make Me Do Things, there's a story called On Earth, and there's a mom who seems quite delighted with her life as a mother. She seems quite delighted in her marriage as well to a very good man, and she, for no real good reason, by the third sentence of the story, you learn is also having an affair. And she's made a choice of having an affair just to sort of have that. She doesn't know why. I mean, I could say these reasons, but she doesn't really know why. It's sort of to create the disaster before the disaster comes to her until she begins to panic. But again, the last thing I would say is one of the things that I have found interesting in writing characters that don't always behave well in the world is how quickly people want to ask me if it's about me. So, it used to be after I would give a reading from Loverboy, the first hand would go up in the audience and say, "Do you have children?" And, I began to find more clever, like, yes, I have children, but I don't have a garage. The garage figures in that novel. But the notion that if I move in a direction like that, if I look at the range of what it is to be female, if I explore darkness as a choice, either that people find themselves in or that people choose for a variety of reasons, the idea that I as a writer have gone there would indicate that it's a kind of mirror to my pretty regular kind of good citizen life. And that's the final thing I would say. I think that in life, my I think of my job in life is to be a good citizen. One of my jobs in life is to be a good citizen, however I determine that. But that's not, as a writer, I think, my job on the page. I don't think my job on the page is to be a good citizen. I think it's to explore the experience of what it is to be human, as best I can. I obviously can't be every kind of human, but it's what I can aspire to in the way that a writer like Shakespeare, I think, aspired. It's part of what makes him great, is the range of all the ways to be human. Thanks.
Thank you. I can't, you found out yourself, but I can attest that women actually really crave that dark, complicated story, because when my last book came out, I had, and I still have, 2, 3, 4 years later, I don't even know how long it's been, I still get emails from women saying, I found your book, and then I sat on the floor and I cried. And so I think that the stories that we're talking about are really, really important. My first book was a novel, and I did end up creating a character, a woman who gave away one of her children, so I've worked with characters a lot, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my second book, where I didn't create a character. It was a memoir, which is to say, I guess, that I recorded the process of finding myself and my identity. And it didn't start out that way either. My memoir is called Hiroshima in the Morning, and it chronicles a period of time where I went to Japan. I had 2 small children, and I had gotten a grant to go and live in Hiroshima for 6 months to do some work with the hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors. I wanted to write a novel about a woman who survives the Japanese-American internment camps and then goes to Japan and gets stuck in the middle of Hiroshima. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me because I won this grant. I was able to go for 6 months. I had 2 small children, and my husband said go, so I went. And over that 6-month period, a lot happened. One of the main things that happened was September 11th happened. So I had been there for 3 months, and I had been interviewing the survivors of the atomic bomb, and then all of a sudden the world flipped upside down. And prior to 9/11, I had been having a lot of trouble getting a very old story out of people. And after 9/11, our entire sense of safety shifted, and their stories began to really change. And so I was really privileged to be in a place where I could see the stories that people were telling about themselves and their families shifting and changing. And it was really amazing and fascinating. And I wanted to capture that. So I went home every day and I wrote and I just wrote everything that I was seeing and feeling and hearing. And at the same time, in a very stressful world, at a time when I had already been gone for 3 months, my marriage was really on the rocks. I wanted my husband and my children to come to me, and they wanted me to come home, and it became a very fraught time. They did finally come and spend 2 months in Japan, but at that period of time when everybody around me was kind of reconceiving who they were, and even the people I knew in New York were reconceiving who they were, and the world was kind of taking a look and thinking about us and them. I was reconceiving who I was too, and I was realizing that this was my first time away from home, my first time living alone, and I was remembering who I was before I got married to my childhood sweetheart, and realizing that person was still kind of waiting in the wings. And for the many, many years that I had been married, she was kind of quiet. And one of the other big pieces of my story was that I had not really wanted to be a mother. In fact, I never wanted to be a mother. My husband really wanted to be a father, so we had children, and we had a deal that he was going to take care of the kids. So as my marriage was falling apart, I was also trying to figure out what I was going to do as a divorced person with and to create a motherhood. So I was really interested in claiming my motherhood, ironically, as it turns out, and trying to find a way to be a very present mother without being a full-time mother or even the mother that the kids live with. So my story, my memoir, was about an awful lot of things. And the interesting thing is that when it came out, the thing that everybody got really up in arms about was the piece of my story, and specifically that I had left my children, which I hadn't done. And specifically that I had gone out into the world and told said that I had never loved my children, which I had not done. And there was a huge outrage. I mean, I was getting these terrible emails. I was getting death threats. I was getting really awful, sexually violent stuff. Like I couldn't even touch my computer for a long time. And it became a kind of a thing, and the idea that I had gone out and done this and now everybody was jumping on me became a story of its own, which is how I ended up on the Today Show and how I ended up on The View. And I had not been prepared for this because I wasn't writing the story of a bad mother. I thought I was writing the story of a good mother, but I was just writing the story of me. So I was kind of fumbling around trying to figure out, well, how do I answer all of these questions? And then I went out to dinner with two very dear friends, and they said, look, you don't have anything to apologize for. It was just like, holy moly. And that really helped me. I think that the really interesting thing for me, though, is that the story that was continually around me was not actually my story. It was a story that people had kind of imposed on me, this idea of, well, you're a bad person, you're a bad mother, your children are going to end up in jail, they're going to be murderers, they're going to be all this thing, which had absolutely no reflection on what I was living. And even when I was in a situation, like I was on 20/20 most recently, they spent 8 hours with me in 5 different places, and I got 4 minutes on TV. So they really they will make you say whatever you want, whatever they want you to say. But there's always this question of, well, now that you know the world hates you, now that everybody has come down on you, would you do the same thing, or have you learned your lesson? Which is just insane, It's like, and my answer, which is always cut, is like, absolutely, I would do the same thing. My children are, we have a terrific relationship. They're learning what it's like to see a woman who lives her life the way that she wants to live. And I want them to surround themselves with people who are doing that, whether they're men or women. So yes, absolutely, and that always gets cut. And I think it's really about, I think there's a fear. Because the truth is, I didn't do anything wrong. I feel like, for me, in my own individual way, I did something right, and I think that's more of a challenge to the situation than if I had left my children and we were all floundering and failing. The fact that I didn't leave them and I created something new was the thing that people really had to push away. So even the so-called positive feedback was really about, well, how can we cut you off and say, well, we'll leave it at maybe you love your children, or whatever it was. So that was this kind of an interesting experience of somebody I don't think of myself as making bad choices or good choices. I just think of myself as making choices, and those choices worked. And it's really that idea of what other people want to put on top of you that is what makes a panel like this even a panel, So there you go.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to ask a few questions to get the conversation started, and then we'll open it up to panelists to respond and ask questions, and then to all of you. So, Reiko, you just had me thinking about the point of how your answer always gets cut from that question of would you do the same thing, and thinking about also Bridgette's work and Victoria's work and Monica's work, that there's these kind of there's certain narratives that get told over and over again, or that are reinforced about the way things should be. And do you feel that in this age of like super saturation of social media and blogs and web series and cable and all of these things, if that has improved the kinds of stories that get told, or if a kind of some kind of stronger dominant cultural force is constantly intervening and making sure that the narratives stay certain ways?
That's for me. I think it's both. I think that just the fact that writers now have access to publishing their own work is really important. It's really changing what we read, and that we have publishers like the Feminist Press that will take a book, because when my book tried to go out into the world, nobody would buy it either, and it was always because it was either that I was not particularly appealing, or that I had too many stories, which I thought was a good thing. So I think that the publishing and the access to the internet is really helpful on one hand, but on the other hand, people seem to have. Perhaps we get used to a shorter attention span, so it's like a quick thing. Because when people were trying to approach my book, they weren't reading my book. They would say they would refuse to read my book. They weren't reading the article that I wrote. They weren't. They were reading the title of the article, and then they were responding to the title of the article. So that really is a whole thing in itself, that we're not chewing over stories anymore and really trying to figure out what that experience offers without the kind of quick labels that we put on something and then flip the page.
I guess I think the both are at play too. I like to believe that why we read books is not to confirm our opinions, but that we read to challenge our imaginations. I mean, it's part of, I believe, why we read books, that we want to have that we're stuck inside our own consciousness. And the opportunity of a book is to engage with the imagination of another person, to engage with the possibilities of other characters, to see what makes someone tick. And I believe that's what our hunger is, as opposed to that's right, that's good, that's bad, that's good, that's bad. That said, I think there's plenty of that goes on. Why would you write a book like that? Why would you write a story in which a mother wants to hold on so tight to her kid, despite all the things she brings him, that she wouldn't want to let him go to school, that she wants to keep him? Well, because I think people have that urge. I think what we get to enact in a novel, or what you bravely get to allow us to do in a memoir, is to enter into another person's path for a while. It's not necessarily ours, but I think that's what our hunger for is, the gift to enter into other imaginations.
Does anyone else like to respond? And then I wanted to ask about breaking the rules and being bad women in terms of form as writers. If you think about that in terms of how you approach a narrative, or maybe Victoria as a poet, and thinking about breaking the rules of writing and how that relates to or doesn't relate to the story that you're telling about your characters.
Sorry. We're already bad.
Very bad.
Is it any better that it's my son calling me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
What was the question?
Form.
It was about form, about being bad in terms of form, or breaking the rules in terms of form as a writer.
Well, I mean, again, I don't think of it that way, but my memoir, I had a lot of juggling to do, and I had never written a memoir, so the first draft of my memoir was like everything that ever happened to me in that 6-month period, which, as you can imagine, is deadly boring. And so I had to kind of break it up, and I wanted to reflect what people were saying to me. I wanted to reflect my experience. I wanted to reflect how it changed. I wanted to not impose my own story on top of a story that I consider to be really important historically and politically. I feel like the survivors' stories are something that we almost never hear. But I also wanted to underpin it in something that someone could perhaps respond to, I thought positively. But so it took me a long time to thread those pieces together. So I ended up with memoir pieces, diary pieces, actual transcripts from the interviews themselves, some emails, and I also worked with first person and third person. I switched it, and then also present tense and past tense. So the story as it moves more and more into present tense. So I did an awful lot with a craft, not necessarily to reflect the issues that we're talking about, but just because I felt like for me it was a complicated story, and I was interested in telling it that way.
Well, I think I've always written about women. I think like most of my, or maybe all of my novels, 6 or 7 novels, has spoken about women. Actually, I guess I understand us better than I can really understand men, because my male characters, sometimes people tell me that they are too sensitive and too sensible and too timid and things like that, for being male. Anyway, I think there are men like that too. And I try to portray all kinds of women, It just comes out like that. I think every one of my women in my novels is completely different than the other one. And I think this is what for me means to write a feminist novel, to portray as many different characters, female characters, as possible. And, and I think like each character also needs a different style. So I think like every novel has a very different style than another one. I don't know, some of my readers also might, we could discuss that, if they would also see it in this way, but I would probably get bored if I wrote always in the same style. So I try to experiment with style in every novel I write, and try to be innovative for myself, to do something different than I have done in the previous novel. And also somehow the female character asks for the different style to be used, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. My story is really the story of a young woman who follows in the footsteps of her older sister who dies in Nigeria. That's the character I was describing earlier. So her younger sister is sort of trying to find out what really happened to this person she loved so dearly. And so I remember in early drafts of creating the story, my agent, who's wonderful in many ways, kept saying to me, his thing was, why don't you just start with her on the plane on her way to Nigeria, the younger sister. And I thought, okay, he's my agent, he should know what, I guess that's a good idea. And I kept trying to write it that way. And it wasn't working, and I was trying to do these awkward flashbacks and sort of have her thinking of things to try to get this narrative into the story. And then I realized, no, actually, I want to tell her story when she's still at home, sort of grappling with that sort of stasis that occurs when you're grieving and you don't really understand why, and you're wanting someone, longing for this person who's gone, and you can't move on in your life. And I mean, this is a complicated sort of internal world that I think a lot of women understand and are not afraid of. And it was okay, I finally decided, to spend 100 pages or more with her in that space and place and mental sort of complicated moment before she decides to do that active thing, to go out in the world and figure out and be on a search and figure out what happened to her older sister. And I honestly thought that is probably not the way a lot, and I'm generalizing, but I think there's some truth there. That's probably not the way a lot of men tend to write stories or think they want to read stories. He's, I'm not singling him out. I just think it was really informative that he was saying to me, do you think people will care? Will you hold their attention to spend all these pages sort of having her still at home, just doing these things? And I'm thinking, yeah, I do. I actually do. And I now have proof because Feminist Press bought my book and it's structured just that way. So I just thought maybe that is the kind of way of writing, being a bad woman and writing the way that makes sense for me, against some really strong advice. Sometimes it's hard to ignore the advice, especially when you respect the person and you know that they know what they're talking about. They're experts in the industry. How do you push back and say, this is how I'm telling this? I find value. I think readers will too. Not every woman wants a happy story, right? It's the same kind of thing, I think. Yeah.
Before we open it up to the audience, I wanted to just ask the panelists if you have any questions or comments for each other.
Well, I'd like to hear what other people might have to say.
I think there's a mic coming around. If you just hold on one moment.
The first part is, in any of your fiction writing, have you ever flipped the gender? Like, while you're writing the story, change all the men to women and all the women to men, or one or more of the characters? And the other, that if you don't have anything to say about that, I'd just like to hear more about your experience inside the publishing industry with responses from male versus female editors or agents.
I'll start with your first question. In Make Me Do Things, this collection of stories, there are, I think, 11 stories in the book, and 6 of them are sort of the point of view, from a POV of a man, and 5 of them are point of view of a woman. I mean, mostly they're in third person, but a very close third, so you're really inside his head, you're really inside her head. And in 1 or 2 cases, I entered into a story from the other perspective, and the story wasn't moving. And but I knew that there was something in it that I wanted, and so I backed off and went male or went female, and it was useful. It was useful, and sometimes it for me was writing further away from a place of my own comfort or my own sense of knowing. So yeah, I have switched around, and in my second novel, In the Border of Truth, that novel flips back and forth. It's half of the book is an epistolary novel written by a boy who's 17. It's 1940. He's a Belgian kid fleeing in Europe. And the other half the book, although it's moving back and forth, is in 2003, and it's in third person, but very close to a woman who's 40 years old who's living in New York. who you come to realize is the adult child of this man. And so there was time that I got to play with. There was, writing being a man, writing being a woman, and I love the range. I loved being a man in all different kinds of men in the stories I've written.
Well, I have in one of my novels. There was like a female character that was supposed to be the main character, and then I changed it for a man. It became a man, a very special man, very an artist and all that. But as I said before, most of my protagonists are women. But it's funny because sometimes I want to write about women that, it's never myself. People, somebody said that, I think you, Victoria, that readers usually ask you, is it you? Did it happen to you? Did you do that? Well, no, I don't write about myself, and I don't know how to write about myself. But there is one thing. Usually, sometimes I want to write about, like, normal women who are inside the society, and usually somehow in the writing the woman is like on the edge of the society. Always my female characters are on the edge of the society, and I think it's probably something of myself that I might feel because of my condition of émigré, that I'm actually I have no home, or my home is everywhere in the world, So I might feel that, like, no language is my own, and all of them are my own, But at the same time, you kind of might feel like on the edge of the society, and so are my characters, I think that was part of the question, right? And also as far as the publishers, right? That was the other part. I've worked with men and women, and I've had a very special relationship with, like, women publishers, because we really talk about the book. I really get to, in the discussion of the characters, of the action, of why this happens, and all that. This is what like female publishers do to me, like Amy, right, and others. Amy of the Feminist Press, who couldn't come today, but I also have men who are good publishers and nice men and everything else, but we don't get into these discussions, unfortunately.
Hi. Yeah, this is for Monica, and maybe for the other speakers also. It's about translation. You write in Czech, I think, often first, right? And then you translate into Spanish or Catalan, and now you have translation into English. I'm wondering if your protagonists, like the Duquesa de Alba and Goya's Glass, the Silent Women, do you find the language, the translation changes them somewhat? When you read your native language, then you read what you wrote in Spanish or Catalan, and now the translation into English. Are they almost different people? Do they stay the same? Does culture affect, the culture they're in with the language? And also now you have a male translator for English. Do you think if you had a female translator, the women might be different in your books? I'm just curious. And any of you who might have your works translated, or you think about it. I don't know. Those are my questions.
I translate my own books because I want the protagonists to remain what they are in the original language, right? And in my English translation, it is my translator is a male translator, and he is a writer himself. So he's very, very careful and very cautious, and so I think he does a very, very good job, and but it's true that I do work all of my translations into languages that I know very well, like the 4 languages that you just mentioned. Luckily, I don't know more languages that well, because otherwise I would get into trouble, and I wouldn't be doing anything else than just proofreading translations, right? Well, the question is very good because the translations are extremely important, and a translation could ruin a book, and it could really change characters as it had happened with some translations. One of the example of it is the first translation of Madame Bovary that we mentioned before, done by the daughter of Karl Marx. And, she really changed Emma Bovary. Emma Bovary became like a very idealized woman, not the one Flaubert wrote about.
This is for Monica as well. When you were speaking with the male editors that didn't really get into talking about the female characters like the women did, why do you think you must have some thoughts on why you think they didn't go into talking to you about it? And the second was when you changed the female character into a male character, why? What were your reasons?
What was the first part? About the publishers. Well, I think I think it's probably out of shyness. I think my male publishers might be too shy to discuss, to get into discussion about these characters. I think they are very shy, and I think these female characters are overwhelming. So, so they might get scared by these bad women. that might be like, I don't know. I never asked them, but this is what I guess that could be the reason or part of it. And why I changed? Once I changed a female character for a male character because I needed like more seduction between sexes, right? I needed more of a sexual play, even in conversation and in action and everything between like men and women. So there is like a triangle of 2 women and a man, and it's kind of not very. We can just guess, that the women have a relationship between themselves, but then both of them are also attracted to the man, So it's like everybody's attracted to everybody else. That's why I did it, because I thought like it would be more interesting to have a triangle like that rather than just 3 women.
This is a question for all of you. I was thinking about the fact that maybe to create a bad woman, you had to, it seems at least in your plot line, create a very bad woman, okay? You had to create a plot line that would be shocking, totally unexpected. It isn't quite enough to have a rebellious woman or a complicated woman or a conflicted woman or one that occasionally makes a sort of not so good choice, but one who doesn't keep her children, one who leaves her children in the leaves and one doesn't know what happened, one who is addicted to heroin, one who, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is do you feel that in creating bad or in the process of this evolution of this character, the plot was being pushed to in a direction of very bad as a way of liberating women from whatever stereotypes women have?
That's a great question. I know I was so appalled and stunned when I realized that my main character had to get involved with her deceased sister's boyfriend. I just thought, no. But it was so bizarre trying to avoid it. Like, I finally realized I was trying to avoid it. And that was crazy. It was what she needed to do to get through the process of understanding herself outside of her sister. Strangely enough, that was what needed to happen. And I was really, really stunned at my own reaction, because that felt to me like a taboo. And I had to push past my own beliefs, my own sort of biases around that. And people say they listen to their characters, but I really just had to free up that space and be completely non-judgmental and, yeah, have the characters go there, because she just needed to go there. So, yeah.
As you were speaking, I started thinking about even the premise of a bad woman. And in a sense, a part of me rebels against that as even as a label. You know, you can think of, I don't know, what's a story we all know? Odysseus coming home, right, from the war. A hero, right? A war hero returning home to a marriage that he hopes to inhabit. And yet, the process of Odysseus returning home engages adultery on many an island, lying. He loses his men to, to creatures, to situations, and saves himself. Do we think of him as a bad man? We think of him as a heroic character in the returning from war and what war has done and the 20 years he needs to get back into a domestic world again. And so the questions of what's taboo, what we even think of as taboo, yes, people, really all that character did was go into the woods and not bring her kids home from the rain. I mean, what she's done or what she hasn't done is ambiguous. And the ways that things, I would assume for men and women, occur in our hearts are often ambiguous. Our actions even sometimes are actually transgressive, but mostly they probably live on some really much stranger boundary. I'll say this last thing. When I was writing a collection of poems called Swoon, second collection, I had as the idea behind it, what would it be to, it's pretty much all about women. And so what would it be to sort of create a book in which you had a woman who was a thinking woman, a sexual woman, a mother, some days a great mom, some days a crappy mom, some days happy in her relationships, some days wanting to flee them. In other words, a person probably a lot like any of us. And what was hard formally, just to come back to this, was to have those things stacked up. I thought originally the form would be a mother poem next to a sex poem next to a poem that was all about the mind. And it was very hard to manage formally, and because the vision was so kooky of her, of inside the book. And I wound up making sections, which I think of in some sense as a failure. So there's a sort of better characters of women created in one section, and more kind of wild and maybe dangerously sexy in another. And I think it was a failure of the book in some sense to have not figured out how to have it all be one big mush.
I think too, I didn't, obviously in my memoir, I didn't set out to make a bad woman, and I don't actually think that any of the choices that I made were bad in any way. But when I was writing my first book, which was about the Japanese American internment, I was doing some interviews with some people who'd been interned, and this older guy in a retirement home came up to me and he said, "Write a pot boiler. People are bored of like the nice victim." And I think that there is catharsis that we go to reading for. And you were talking about how we like to wander around and really chew over somebody else's life. If all of your characters have their equilibrium, is not so interesting because I think, and maybe this is just me, but I feel like I go to a book because I want to test what else there is out there in a space that I can really get into, but is also relatively safe. So I can see what other minds and other lives and other choices look like, and I can really feel the consequences of those. So I didn't certainly set out to write something that was going to shock and appall people, but I do find that as a reader, I want a book that moves. I want somebody who's going to go out there and put things at risk and where there are stakes. So
I didn't try to portray a bad woman, really. As I said, it was a woman, but she has many components of cruelty in her. Like I think most of us do. Sometimes we want to hide it. Sometimes we just don't want to think about these components of cruelty that we have. But we definitely do. And also, I think I'm not sure if consciously or subconsciously, I always have in mind what you just said about Odysseus. Well, he goes to war and then he wants to go back home. So he goes on a trip, right? And he takes all the good things life offers him, right? If a woman did that and didn't go straight home to her husband and her kids and, just dared to take something good life offers to her, oh my gosh, I mean, she would be not a bad woman, but a terrible woman, and so I always try to think about this and portray a woman who would behave like a man, maybe, and well, that's what makes her a bad woman.
We have time for just one more question. Yes.
I come from a generation that we did a lot of transgressing, in the 60s and 70s. And I haven't heard it here yet, except in all your narratives, I keep hearing, bad seems to be the equivalent of power. When we take power, we're bad. And when we're submissive or when we have to suffer afterward, be the victim, that makes it okay again, because we've given our power back up. And I see it in all of your things. And like when you were saying you wanted to make a woman who's heroic and sexy, heroic is sexy. I mean, it's like, I was thinking when I go looking for a book as a reader, I'm looking for something that will give me that catharsis of taking some power. Whether it's the spunky little New York detective female, or whether it's... I frankly, even things like Lorena Bobbitt, every woman I know, the first time they heard Lorena Bobbitt, they're all going, oh, geez, or Medea kills her kids, and you're going, oh, geez, like it's something you're not allowed to think of, of you taking the ultimate power, and that's what I think most guys are scared of, and I look for that in a book. I wanted Thelma and Louise to get away to Mexico, so I don't know how you see that happening when you write, because you're writing complex, real people. You're not writing a stereotype, but how does that kind of thing figure in?
Well, I'd just love to say that when we came up with the title for the panel, it was kind of more of a marketing tactic to have something fun and, dangerous. And so, so when we say bad, none of us actually intend that these are... Right. Yeah, so that is what's come up. So if anyone else would like to say anything about that.
Well, in my Silent Woman, it's precisely when the woman wants to, when Silva, the protagonist, wants to grab power, that's when she becomes cruel. Because, the one thing goes with with the other, at least in this novel. Probably not always, but here in this novel, it definitely does. So your question was just perfect.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, wanting to create this heroic character. I do want to stress that it is important. It was important to me to distinguish between an asexual, heroic black woman that we've all seen. Harriet Tubman, right? Who wasn't? She said, "Ain't I a woman?" What do you think she was saying? I'm a sexual being. She bore how many Sojourner? Sorry, but the same concept. The idea that it was important to create her humanity. Even as I was pointing out, I was wanting to stress that this woman was believing in something bigger than herself and willing to risk her life for it, and was still a flesh and blood woman. And so I agree with you, but I also feel that in a lot of situations, African American women have their sexuality taken from them. It's like they can't have both for some reason. We should all have both, absolutely. We should have all of it, right? Imperfections, heroics, complications, bad choices, or wrong decisions, and all of it should coexist. I am just thinking, why couldn't you have made that messy collection and put those poems up against one another? Why not? Why not?
I tried.
Yeah.
In Loverboy, in the first draft of Loverboy, this is a little bit about agency and sort of the fun I wound up having. But in the first draft of it, I was so committed to a kind of single-mindedness in the protagonist that I had made a lot of formal decisions. That there were no flashbacks. It was just her and him, her and him, her and him. What was going to happen? And but my first reader, when I'd finished the draft, said, "How'd she have the baby, Vic?" And I said, "Well, that's not important because it's right now, right here, right." And she said, "Well, no, you're really going to have to do this." And as soon as I capitulated and gave myself permission, I knew, as I had said to you, she never wanted a house and she never wanted a husband. And she begins to sort of embark, at least initially, on she determines that many men equals no father. And so she kind of goes out on a rampage of collecting. And she sperm. And she has done a little bit, she's bookish, nerdish, and she's done some reading to realize that in certain tribes, Amazonian, South American tribes, there was that same process, collecting sperm, and the idea that, for one thing, a lot of guys in the village would think they might be the dad and, pony up and take care of things, and also the idea that somehow the best of would be collected. So it was what I found was a huge amount of fun for me as a writer, in creating a character who went about something with a single-minded desire. And then to complicate the plot, things backfire for her, so many other things happen other than what I've just said. But to allow my character that kind of agency, to use your word, was a lot of fun. It was great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.